Okay.
Thanks, Wayne. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here with you. And yeah, thanks for making the time to be with us at SAFCEI. My job is pretty simple. I'm just going to welcome you. And those of you who don't know the organization very well, we're the Southern African Faith Communities Environment Institute, and we've been working on energy governance issues, I think, since the inception of the organization in 2005. And have been following nuclear in particular because the energy governance is such a complex issue in South Africa. We see issues with how coal is being done, load shedding, electricity costs, pollution of coal, the gas expansion, seismic testing. There are the lack of renewables being rolled out and so on. So there are many aspects of energy governance that are problematic in South Africa. And for a long time, SAFCEI has been working to look specifically at nuclear energy as part of the energy mix, because it has been a very big vehicle for corruption. It has been an issue that was part of the trillion rand illegal and unconstitutional deal with Russia and others that was declared so by the courts in 2017. And so we're very privileged to have Angela and Andrew with us, Angela and Adrian with us this afternoon. They were part of the original legal team who took government to court back in 2015. And so they are extremely knowledgeable about nuclear issues, and they're going to explain to us why the extension of the life of the Koeberg Nuclear Power Plant here in the Cape is such a big issue and something that we should all be concerned about out within the whole of the country and also regionally. So the Koeberg Power Plant is the only power plant, active nuclear power plant in Africa, except for Egypt, I think. And so it's quite unique, and it has particular problems. It's coming to the end of its life next year. So Angela's been doing some deep dives into this concept of extending the life of a power plant that's meant to be ending. And when you're dealing with nuclear, that brings up a whole raft of interesting aspects that we need to consider and be aware of. So I'm going to hand over to Angela, if that's okay, Wayne, if Angela's next in the line. Angela, hello and welcome. And over to you.
Thanks, Francesca. Yeah. Hi, Angela, please go ahead. I've got your slides you want me to share, but you can go ahead and let me know. Thanks.
Wayne, would you mind putting the slides up?
Of course. Here we go. You should be able to see them now. Please confirm that you can.
I can see them. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. These slides are very short and sweet. They don't explain much, so I will be addressing them in more detail. So what is LTO, long-term operation? You know, we have a nuclear power plant which has a license. I think it was a 30 or 40-year license, and that license is about to come to an end. So there are 2 units. The license comes to an end for the first unit in the middle of next year, and for the second unit in November 2025. So without a license, it cannot continue to operate, and hence they have applied for the extension of the life of the license, and we call that LTO, long-term operation. I think that's what it is. Okay, so what I have been doing to try to assist SAFCEI is to look at what's going on all over the world, because it's running into hundreds of nuclear power stations are applying. They're all of the same sort of vintage, so they're coming to the end of their licenses, and hundreds of them are applying for LTO, extension of life, and not all of them are getting that extension. And hence, it doesn't mean automatically, because you haven't had a big accident, that another 30 years will be safe. There's a very, very detailed process that has to take place before it can be considered perhaps safe, but one can never say, of course, when you're dealing with nuclear power stations. All right, so best practice, I talk about international best practice. Our nuclear power station was based on French technology, and the French are very far, they have a lot of nuclear power stations, and they are very far advanced with regulating nuclear power stations. And after looking at everything all over the world, my personal lay opinion is that France is a good example of best practice. And since our plant is also French design, it's helpful to look at what the French are doing. Firstly, when you look at the word length of time, we've got an application for, is it 20 or 30 years more? I can't remember, but it's over 20 years more life that Eskom wants for this plant. Now in France, they don't grant more than 10 years. And what is interesting about our regulations is they say that there's a regulation 4 which governs the extension of life of nuclear power stations, and it says that Eskom must demonstrate that it has the available financial and human resources for the period. Now, I think, is it 30 or 20 years, Wayne? Sorry, my ignorance. Is it 30-year?
20.
Is it 20? Okay. I mean, look, it doesn't take a lot to imagine how difficult it must be to be able to say with certainty that you have the available financial and human resources for 20 years for a nuclear power station, especially in a country where our debt to GDP ratio is growing enormously every year. We all know about the humongous debt that Eskom has run up, which the state has taken over. So we're in a very financially constrained environment, yet we have to Eskom has to demonstrate that we have the financial and human resources for the next 20 years for a nuclear power station. And don't forget that this is not in a happy grid where we got lots of power. We have a very constrained grid. It's subject to a lot of load shedding, and that creates a lot of challenges for nuclear power stations that I'm going to talk about as well. So the first thing that we need, if we're going to make submissions to the powers that be, we need to say, well, perhaps I'm wrong, and I invite anybody else to look at the documentation, but I didn't see a very clear case being made that Eskom has the financial and human resources for the next 20 years. I think we need to look a little more deeply into that before we make our submissions, but I think it's an important issue. Okay. Now in France, let's go back to best practice again. France has got a very interesting approach to this. They say that whatever has changed in regard to the regulation of nuclear power stations must be applied to the extension of life. So in other words, if the standards were very weak 30 years ago, doesn't mean those standards must be applied to the extension of life. It must be dealt with as if it was a brand new power station. And you can imagine there have been various accidents over the years which required upgrades to those standards, and it all turns into cost. Now, I didn't see that kind of level of best practice being applied. What you see in the documentation is it says that the application tries to comply with good international practice. But best practice would mean you've got to look at the state-of-the-art brand new nuclear power station, and you have to apply the safety standards that you have applicable to that, to this one. And if not, then why not? All right, then there's another issue and then let's talk about a bit more about the French. They also say that you have to review the safety every 10 years. You keep reviewing and reviewing. And before you can get an extension, your review has to conform with the environmental code. Now, when you look at our situation, there's an article I've been reading this morning about the safety report and the assessments of Koeberg by the International Atomic Energy Association. And there's several issues that need to be addressed about safety, which apparently even though we're quite late in the progress of this LTO application, those things haven't been addressed. So if you compare that to France, which says you've got to be up to speed with your environmental code, are we lacking? And is this a matter for concern? Now, the reason I ask that in a general question is that obviously things proceed slowly with a humongous machine like a nuclear power station. You might have a safety issue, but you can't address it unless you shut it down. So you've got to wait till there's a shutdown. So, repairing and fixing safety issues, it does take time. And often I think they also say this in France, that, they just get to the end of the review process and already they have to start the next one because it takes so long. But even aside from that, are we in a good position to proceed with the long-term operation? Are our safety considerations properly addressed? Do we have the money for that period of time? And I don't see that in the reports, but we're going to have a last good look at that before we make submissions. Okay, so the last point on this slide is financial constraints. Now, in the course of looking at all these examples internationally of people, sometimes it's private companies applying for extension of life of nuclear power stations. Some of them were not given permission because the costs of addressing the safety issues were too high to make it a good financial prospect. Okay, so in other words, you look at the safety issues, you look what it's going to cost to fix them, and if it doesn't make economic sense, you don't go on with it. We needed to have looked at all the costs, all the money we got, and ascertain whether we can afford this or not. If that's not abundantly clear from these documents, why not? What are we sort of fudging over that we're not addressing, or are we applying a lower standard? So these are questions that we will put into our submission if there are not adequate answers in the documentation. All right, I think I've said enough on that slide. How much time? I don't know how the time's going. I think I've got
you're okay, Angela. I'll just get to your next slide. Sorry.
I'm going very slowly here.
There we go.
All right, that's a big slide. Don't read it. It's just a few important points that have come through up to now that are general concerns regarding the extension of life. The first one is called aging management. Look, I'm not an expert, so I say these things with limited knowledge, but parts of a nuclear power station do age over time because of the intense heat and pressure that a machine like this experiences. And the many, many thousands of parts have to be replaced when they are too old to function properly. And if they're left there, presumably they could create a safety issue. Now, all over the world, there is a massive amount of money going into aging management because obviously lots of power stations are continuing. Is our aging management scheme up to standard? That's the question. We haven't got an expert report on that yet, but that's just a question we need to say something about. And why it's important now is because of load shedding. Load shedding and the unstable grid. Look, nuclear power stations do trip. They are expected to trip. That means they go off and they have to be switched on again. But because they are so hot, they have to be cooled down slowly and carefully and then started up again. Now, if you're going to have a lot of tripping, I'm not an expert. I know nothing about this, but I would think that might have an impact on the aging and weakening of the system. And that has to be considered because that's what we face. So our questions to the decision maker are, why haven't you even mentioned, not decision maker, our question to Eskom in its application is, why is there no mention of load shedding? There needs to be an analysis of how load shedding impacts on the safety of this plant and on its aging. Okay. There are other issues if we were not in a load shedding environment. Greenpeace, for example, has said that there are parts of the power station you can't get to unless you weaken it. You know, you have to cut through walls that were there to keep it strong. And they're very concerned, Greenpeace, about the extension of life of nuclear power stations. There's also the third issue, which is about corrosion. Has that been addressed? Yeah, okay, so that's basically the other points I've covered already. Thanks. Well, do you mind if I just close my door?
No problem. Just to say, while Angela just stepped away, there are 1 or 2 questions. I'm just going to let her run through her presentation first, and then we'll take some questions. Mazwi, I note your hand. Thank you. Go ahead, Angela.
I think, can you let me finish my presentation, because many of the questions will be answered.
Sure.
And I don't want to get diverted into technical discussion. So, sorry, maybe have the next one, please.
No, sure. There we go.
Okay, there are issues that people are raising, they are unhappy about. I'm not going into a lot of detail, but redaction means you cut out parts of the document with a black pen or something. There's extensive redaction of the safety report. In other words, can we even make comments with that? There's no EIA happening. We lawyers are still not sure whether you do need an EIA if you don't increase the footprint, but that point has been raised. Once again, the impact of load shedding. I think, this is in the way here, this way, of my thing. And the whole possibility of a grid collapse. Okay, this word grid collapse comes up all the time these days. You know, what would happen if there was a grid collapse? And then finally, can you come to the conclusion that the continued operation of Koeberg is not an unacceptable safety risk? Now, if I just go back to the things that I've been looking into, in Puerto Rico, which is a part of the USA, I think it is part of the USA, or it's not a separate country, but it doesn't have a stable grid. A stable grid is one where the supply of electricity and the demand are in sync, and the frequency of electricity is not fluctuating a lot. Now, they were thinking of putting nuclear power stations in Puerto Rico, but because of the unstable grid, they thought it was not a good idea. Okay, so we all accept now that for the foreseeable future, we don't have enough supply of electricity for the demand. We have to keep load shedding to keep these things into supply and demand to be equal. It's an unstable grid. I mean, that is a technical term, but I can assure you it is. And now we have a nuclear power station in an unstable grid. Well, can they convince us that that is not an unacceptable safety risk? We need to make that point. Okay, next slide. Sorry, people, if I'm going too fast and too technical, but we'll get to it. Okay, right. Now, this is all about what happens when you shut down a nuclear power station. You can shut it down intentionally, decommission it, or you can shut it down because something else happens that you weren't intending. But whatever happens when you shut down a nuclear power station, it's got to be cooled slowly, and various things have to stay cool. Otherwise, the fuel heats up, and it can release radiation and cause damage and possibly a catastrophe. So the bottom line is, whether it's on or it's off, it has to have proper cooling systems and proper backup. Now, we've never been worried about that in the past, but in a new era where we face instability in the grid and potential grid collapse, backup for a nuclear power station becomes an issue of concern. And this application needs to look at that, and it needs to provide answers about what kind of risk we face. So, if there was a complete grid collapse, no electricity in this country, finished, boom, what happens to the nuclear power station? It's got enough diesel backup, apparently, for a big disaster like Fukushima, lots of diesel, but what happens when the diesel runs out? If there was a grid collapse, perhaps there wouldn't be, it would probably be social chaos. There might not be good communications. It might be difficult to get diesel or transport diesel. So depending on diesel for a long period of time becomes questionable. We need to ask, well, what are you going to do if we are faced with something like that and we run out of diesel? Because if we run out of diesel and we can't keep the whole place cool, it heats up, and the next thing, we have a nuclear disaster. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but these are the questions. There's something called defense in depth. You have to look in depth at how to prevent these things. Have they applied that principle in a new South Africa where we face an unstable grid and a possibility of a grid collapse? Defense in depth is a concept that's used in nuclear governance. We need to relook at defense in depth in this context very urgently. Okay, next slide. All right, here we go again. I'm just talking about the fact that a total grid collapse is unlikely, but we're not here to read the tea leaves to see what's likely and unlikely. If something is a possibility and it's talked about, it must be evaluated. You can't say it's unlikely. We must look at that. We must say, what is the possibility? Or no, what would happen if it happened? And how do we prevent it with defense in depth? All right, next one. I think I'm just repeating myself. Right, load shedding impacts grid. All right, so all this stuff about how load shedding affects the grid, how it creates instability, how that impacts on nuclear power stations, how it creates risk, how it ages, all that stuff. You know, do we have the backup? All those questions need to be put into one big submission, and we demand answers. If I'm going to advise you, those things have to be answered. If the long-term operation is not granted, we still need backup to keep this thing cool. We still can have a grid collapse. We still have constraints because diesel has to be the backup at the moment. And how do we back it up beyond diesel? Okay, next slide. All right, so the debate that I'm encouraging you to have is, okay, there's one last big issue. There are 2 units at Koeberg. When one unit is offline, it means 1 level of load shedding. When 2 levels are offline, that means 2 levels of load shedding. Okay, so as you remove more and more power from the grid, unfortunately, you've got more and more demand relative to supply. They're out of sync. And that creates the instability that you try to deal with load shedding, but it gets more and more challenging. Okay, so completely remove the nuclear power station means you're removing power from the grid. And the question will be asked of activists, how can you justify that if that's also going to lead to problems? Apparently, there have been promises to bring lots of power onto the grid within the next 18 months. And that just happens to coincide with the end of the license of Koeberg. So perhaps it isn't such a big problem, but the one big concern that I want to raise is, promises are made to bring power onto the grid, but almost everywhere, even globally, big power provision does have delays. Every one of the plants in this country that I know of has had major delays, including Medupi, Kusile, etc., etc. So we can't be absolutely sure that in 18 months' time we will have enough new energy to replace this Koeberg nuclear power station. So the question for activists is, should we just oppose it and it must stop at the end of the next 18 months? Or should we say it should be opposed until there is enough other new energy on the grid to replace it? Because this new grid with all this This new situation we're in with all this instability means that Koeberg is potentially not a very good source of energy. A nuclear power station I mean, I'm not an expert, but I would imagine it's susceptible to aging. If there's lots of tripping, it's not a good place to have it. We need an expert to look at that. We need the Eskom to, in its application, to apply expertise to that situation. So saying we desperately need this thing forever and ever. Well, it might have been okay for the last 30 years, but the grid was stable. Relying on it into the future beyond a certain couple of years might not be such a grand idea, because it's got its own safety issues. So those are my issues for debate. I hope I've managed to convey some of the complexity sufficiently simplified fashion, but I'm happy to answer questions.
Thanks, Angela. Great, that's wonderful. Appreciate that. There are a couple of questions, so I'm going to sort of run through them, and then we can try and get to all of them, if that's okay now. The first one we had was Mazwi. Rev Mazwi, are you there? Can you hear me? Let me just ask him to unmute.
Must I look for the questions in the chat box?
No, that's okay. That one was a hand raised, Angela. So I'm just checking if we can unmute now. If not, then I'll go to the next one. Okay, Rev Mazwi, if you can unmute, you can do so. But in the meanwhile, I'll go to some of the next questions. There was actually two in the chat from Helena, and I do apologize if I'm saying your name incorrectly. But the first one was around, the question was, what are about the storage of high-level waste sitting in pools at Koeberg? Oh, Helena, there you are. Would you like to ask it yourself? Then I don't have to put words in your mouth, as it were.
I have reason to believe that there is a lot of nuclear waste that's been sitting, high-level nuclear waste, that's basically the fuel that comes from the actual Koeberg, it's the spent fuel, and it sits in cooling pools, and those cooling pools are designed for the lifespan of the plant. And what I've heard is that the pools, that the more nuclear waste is added, the more the heat levels of the water cooling pools can be raised if they put too much hot rods in there, because they stay warm. And if they reach a certain temperature, then it turns to steam. And if it turns to steam, there's a problem, because then you've got radioactive steam going around. So that is one of the things that to me seems the most obvious reason why it has a certain lifespan, is that it depends on how much space there is in the pool. And have they built new pools for keeping the high level waste? And then there's the problem of, they still don't know where they're going to put the high level waste, because there is still nowhere in South Africa that can take the stuff. They've only got a place for the old, the low level and intermediate level waste, which is kept in the middle of Bosmanland, foul pits. So that is a big problem. And then the other issue is that it's built on a fault line, and that's a well-known fact. And even the engineers that built it knew that, so they designed it so that it would somehow survive an earthquake. But we've been seeing bigger and bigger earthquakes on the planet recently, and I want to know, is the aged state of this building with all its extra nuclear waste sitting in pools really going to be safe for everyone to handle on the very edge of a big city, right by the sea? And like, if it cracks, what happens? It goes straight into the ocean, and then the whole city will be polluted with nuclear waste, which could potentially ruin everybody's lives. So is it worth the risk? That's my question.
Thanks very much, Helena. Angela, do you wanna take a stab at those two? I
was wondering if Adrian might be interested in answering some of these, because I think, Adrian, you have better grasp of the issue of the waste issue than I do. Maybe you'd spell it out more succinctly, if you wouldn't mind.
Adrian, are you there? Oh, I think I've just tried to unmute and then he unmuted. Hi, Adrian. There you go.
Sorry, I was trying to say I'm struggling to unmute myself, but I got muted again.
Sorry about that. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I'll put on my video for a second and just say hello, everyone, if that's working. But just for my own grid stability, I'm going to keep it off. So hi, everyone.
Hi there.
I'm load shed at the moment, so I'm relying on my little UPS system to keep this going. Yeah, where is it? Yeah, so just in terms of waste, yeah, I mean, you're absolutely correct. The pools are filling up and are due to be full quite soon. According to the safety case, and I don't have multiple screens working in front of me again because of load shedding, but my understanding is what they're aiming to do is place some of that the fuel rods into casks. So they cool to create more space. So the idea is you keep them in there for, I think it's up to about 10 years, and then they cool down sufficiently. And the plan is initially to put them into casks. There was an EIA run a year or two ago for a temporary storage facility, an interim temporary storage facility at Koeberg, which got to go ahead, as far as I can recall. And so the plan is, and that's again these above ground casks to pretty much indefinitely store the nuclear fuel or the spent nuclear fuel rods on site. So that's their interim fix. The idea is that obviously at some point in the future they'll come up with a permanent solution for the high level radioactive waste, which obviously stays radioactive for a hell of a long time. But there's no clear solution to that yet. So that remains obviously a big issue for any nuclear plant that they want to build here and quite frankly elsewhere in the world. I think they've been looking at deep geological depositories and things like that overseas, but as far as I know, no permanent fixes has yet been made. Again, given the length of time these things will stay radioactive. So the radioactivity does degrade while they're in the pools, because there's various kind of toxic components or radioactive components, or maybe not components, but chemicals or whatever that degrade at different stages. But some of the worst ones obviously have a very long half-life, so that remains a problem. So I don't think at the moment they present that they have a solution, at least for filling up the pools, and that's going into the casks and using the temporary storage facility. Obviously, Volpits is used, as you say, for the low-level and kind of intermediate level radioactive waste, but obviously it's not suitable for high-level radioactive waste. So I'm not sure if that answers the question. Angela, can I hand back to you?
Yeah, thanks. I think that answers the question, yes.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I'm going to invite Lydia in a little bit, Lydia Peterson, who's joined us as well. But I do know there's been a lot of talk recently, Elena, about moving the high-level weights to the nuclear dump site at Volpits in the Northern Cape as well. And, whether that goes ahead is up for debate. But, that's been the talk about, is that even an option going forward? Angela, do you want to talk do you have any comments around the fault line and the earthquake proofing of the power plant?
All that I know, also subject to Adrian making his input, is that after Fukushima there were various upgrades globally that were recommended and were implemented all over the place in order to address the consequences of an earthquake such as took place in Japan. And the safety report indicates that these measures have been taken. Beyond that, I don't know much more about the matter.
I think the big takeaway from that as well is that even the safety report does not really adequately answer some of those questions, in terms of the fault line and what will happen if there is a larger earthquake at the Koeberg site.
If I can just come in, just in terms of the actual Well, first of all, I mean, one of the main kind of safeguards that they install when you build a nuclear power station is what they call, I think, aseismic bearings, which basically allow the building to shift as while the earthquake is happening, and that's obviously to prevent cracking of the reactor and things like that. So there's this nuclear island that sits on these aseismic bearings. Those issues were picked up, I think, in the periodic safety review, amongst other things. And if my memory serves me correctly, there was some kind of interim study done, but they're still undergoing a proper seismic assessment for the long-term operation. So what you see in the safety report is arising from various reviews, including by the International Atomic Energy Association and others. There's various things that they have had to fix or will have to fix. So there's kind of two lists. One is things that they're doing and have done, and the other is things that they will be doing in the future. And that, as far as I understand, sits in that future category because it hasn't yet been done at the time of the application. And that basically looks at at those aseismic bearings to see if they're still suitable and able to withstand an earthquake. The design of Koeberg, if I remember correctly, again, was designed to withstand a level 7 earthquake with an epicenter within a couple of kilometers of Koeberg itself, as far as, if I'm remembering it correctly. And then obviously Angela touched on the various upgrades that have either happened or are still happening to address some of the shortcomings identified or revealed by the Fukushima disaster, which was, of course, also a tsunami with various floodings. And that again comes to the question of defense in depth, which is obviously your different layers of protection that each one should by itself be able to protect the plant in theory. So additional diesel mobile generators were made available or contracted. I'm not sure if they're on site. They say they have 2 diesel generators in separate buildings that can operate. There's also, as far as I understand, a direct link to the Acacia open cycled gas turbine, and plans which apparently are delayed to have a direct link when because apparently that ends its life in 2025. There's a plan to link power to a direct line from the Ankerlich power station. But yeah, it's so basically on the aseismic bearings, that's still underway. I mean, it's on their plans, but not yet implemented. And the same thing is with the long-term protection or remedy for the cracking due to the chloride or salt ingress due to the highly corrosive seaside environment that Koeberg is in, where you've got concrete peeling away and some of the reinforcement inside the containment structure rusting. They've obviously been doing some temporary fixes, replacing concrete and that kind of thing, but they claim that the long-term fix is cathodic protection, which I know that they use for example, Transnet pipelines. But that again hasn't yet been implemented. It's on the future action list. Thank you.
Thanks, Adrian. Thanks, Angela. So it does sound to me that even the containment buildings have got the double whammy, attached to them of the sea air, which is corroding there, but also the change in their structure because of the continuous nuclear bombardment that they are having, which is a real concern. Thanks. Lydia, your hand was up. I think you put it down, but just coming back to you. Can't see you now. Maybe you dropped off. Oh, there you are. Hello.
Hi. Hello, and hello, everybody. I don't even actually know where to start because I've got like a sheet full of things here. But if I look at I'm not trying to say how to do the submission. That is not what I'm doing at all. I'm just thinking that a submission should be taking into account the financial implications, quite a lot of time, the length of time, and are we following the best practices of the international community, the standards. So if I look at the financial side of it, there is something called the Nuclear Radioactive Waste Disposal Institute. They are managing the high-level waste or the waste incomplete, which is, and I think that that is not even completely in operation. Then I'm looking also at the projected cost in 2010, which was 20 billion for the refurbishment of Koeberg. In a recent system update, Eskom actually conceded that amount can be significantly higher, to the amount of almost 40 to 50 billion. On the EIA, the Keith Featherstone has said that Koeberg at this very stage is exempted from an EIA, but then I come back to the CISF, which Adrian alluded to, that is for the central interim storage facility, which will house the COSCs, which Helena had alluded to as well. So why would there not be an EIA for an LTO? Because definitely, if you look at the LTO for another 20 years, you will find that, I hope that you can still hear me because I have intermittent.
You can, we've got you,
Okay, so why would there not be an LTO for, an EIA for the LTO, but yet they will have an EIA for the central interim storage facility? So it doesn't make sense because it's the very same things. It is the footprint of the waste that will change. The pools, unfortunately, by 2020 has reached its capacity to store the spent fuel. So what they have done is re-racking it to facilitate that. And at the moment, at Koeberg, there are dry storage casks which house the spent fuel, which has been significantly cooled down for many years. But again, one of these casks cost more than 30 million. So again, extending the life of Koeberg, there cannot be other pools being erected or something like that. So they will rely upon this interim storage, which is the dry casks. So it's more money being spent in something that we could spend the money elsewhere and for renewables and bring that online. There is no other space to house the spent fuel. In the PSIF, it's a Public Safety Information Forum meeting that I was at Eskom, that was on the 1st of December. And there is a document to this effect that they said that there are plans afoot to store the high-level waste at Falputs. And as all of us know, Falputs is only licensed for the low level and the intermediate level. So no plans, as far as I know, even has been made to store the high level waste there. But somebody in that meeting of the 1st of December said that some of the high level waste are already being placed at Falputs. My last point is what we can do for this submission. It is the time frame from the IAEA report, which they came to visit in, I think it was March, and then the submission by Eskom to apply for this LTO with the NNR. The time frame seems not to be adequate for me, in my view. I'm not a technical person or an expert here, but if I look at it from the time that the EIA were here and when the report was submitted to the NNR, that was just a mere few months. And I'm still of the opinion that none of those severe safety concerns that they found were fully addressed, although the public document says, the PD, what is it called? The public information document, the PID, says that most of these things have been fixed, have been attended to, and the others will be done during the LTO. As everybody also know, the heavily redacted safety case, which I also asked the NNR for, and they said that, well, I had sufficient information to do my comment because everything is in there. But there were no time, in my view, to have done all the safety issues that were prevalent with that visit by the International Energy Agency. Thank you, Wayne.
Thanks, Lydia. I'm making sure I'm off mute. Thanks, Lydia. Appreciate your comments. Yeah, you make some really good points as well. I'm just gonna go to Liz. Hi Liz, you had 2 points in the chat. I'm just gonna, if you want to just talk a little bit about them. One was around Vietnam and the how they sort of dealt with the loss of the fossil fuel power of their grid and how they went around that. Do you want to just mention that?
Hello.
Hi there.
I was just gonna sit on the back and listen to everyone else. But the reason that I put that in the chat was, and apologies I came a bit late. Angela raised what I heard was she raised the issue of, well, if we don't do Koeberg, then like it's going to be doom and disaster. And I just wanted to balance that to say that actually there's no guarantee that there will be no other power, because if we switch Koeberg off, and obviously the risks of not switching Koeberg off would outweigh the power loss. The damage from a Koeberg meltdown would be far greater than not having the power. But what I was also going to say is that we know that renewables can get up and running very quickly, and the blockage is political to a large degree, some technical, but grid capacity is one of them. So if you took, grid, then suddenly you would have lots of capacity to put in renewable energy. But so you would need a plan that says we're not going to have Koeberg in 2024. We're actually going to have renewables. And so then you start building them now and you switch them on and you feed them into the grid. And my example about Vietnam was, I think it was in 2020, they put 9.6 gigawatts of solar into the system within 1 year. So it can be done if there's political will. I think that was just my point. And solar PV on the roof is finally starting to catch on at the national level.
Thanks, Liz. Appreciate that. Angela, Adrian, there's been tons of comments. Sorry, I just want to give you an opportunity to respond to some of them.
Perhaps I can just respond to that one from Liz. No, I'm not saying, as you indicate, that it would be more dangerous to take it off, take Koeberg off than keep it on because of all those issues. What I was saying is that we don't have, for exactly the reasons you say, the lack of political will, etc. We don't necessarily have the assurance and the certainty that there will be replacement energy on the grid. And that's all. And hence that brings about certain other risks. But you're correct, it's a political issue.
Thanks. Adrian, do you want to comment as well?
Yeah, maybe just to speak a little bit on the EIA trigger issue. The way our law currently stands, there's two. You need to do an EIA or get environmental authorization following an NEMA EIA process for various listed activities, and most of them, well, there's 3 different listing notices. But the main one, which requires full EIAs, including scoping, is I think GNR, or what is it? I can't remember it now. But that's this listing notice too. So there's 2 triggers there. The one is for the development. So in other words, the establishment of a new nuclear plant and its related operation. And then the second one is for an expansion of and related operation of a new nuclear plant. It gets a little bit more fuzzy when one looks at, well, what is an expansion? So it obviously includes a capacity increase. There was a little bit of talk about Koeberg being uprated some years ago, but that seems to have fallen off the agenda. There is some speculation that may be something they want to do in the future, in which case they would potentially do an EIA at that point. But currently, certainly in the safety case and the public information document, I haven't seen any reference to an increase in the capacity. So you're obviously dealing with an existing plant. The other aspect to that is they talk about, so it's either a capacity increase or where you're increasing its footprint. Now, development footprint is defined, and to a large extent, it would relate to the kind of physical footprint. So if you're going to expand the physical site of Koeberg, it would clearly trigger. And then obviously there's other listed activities such as nuclear waste storage, which triggered the TSIF application, the temporary interim storage facility, TSIF, sorry. So that's obviously why they did EIAs. Obviously, there are some concerns about, well, aren't they splitting it up? And well, the TSIF wasn't obviously just intended for the LTO. I think that there was a whole rationale in various scenarios, if I remember correctly, one of which was, the existing fuels sitting on site can't stay in those pools forever either. And they were, as you know, they were running out of space even up till the current end of design life. So the EIA position isn't entirely 100% clear, but so for us to say that there's clearly a trigger is difficult at this stage. But yeah, there's obviously something that we need to just keep our minds open on and keep looking at the facts to see whether any particular triggers do occur.
Thanks, Adrian. Thanks, Angela. Are there any further comments or questions at this point? There's some chat in the chat box as well from Jenny Williams. Will further guidelines and everything that needs to go into submission be shared with everybody? We do the submission very soon. The layman always appreciates some guidance, especially with such a complicated issue. 100%, Jenny. So we can definitely share that afterwards, some of the other documents you want. But what I will go do now is go through how to make a submission. So it'll be quite easy. And the first part of this meeting was just to understand the main issues that we were bringing up. So 100% with you, Jenny. Francesca.
Thanks, Wayne, and thanks everyone for some of you are extremely knowledgeable, and it's great to hear questions and thinking in the room. I know some people here have been working on nukes for a long time, and some of us are more new to it. And so I hope that those of you who don't follow this as closely as others are feeling like you're more in the know now. I want to just add at this point that there is some discussion amongst our sector, the civil society sector, about the legitimacy of the process for the submission. So because the information has been heavily redacted because of the secrecy, some of the positions that people have been taking has been, we don't want this. And what's more, we don't have the information even to be able to make a proper request as to whether this is a good idea or not. So that's another aspect of the submission process that we can also critique when we make submissions. And if you choose to protest and not make a submission, the merits of that are still under debate, and I would really appreciate it if Adrian and Angela would comment on that, because I think there has been some discussion about sort of a protest not making a submission at all because we so disagree with it. So I'd appreciate some legal minds to give us a little bit of insight into that as well, just so we all understand our rights when we're faced with something like this that none of us want. And we're trying to figure out the best way forward. Thanks.
Thanks, Francesca. Just asking Angela or Adrian, I've got other questions, but maybe you can take that one first. There we go. Go ahead, Angela.
I'd like to give Adrian a chance to perhaps take.
No problem. Where is he? Oh, I don't think we've lost Adrian. Are you still there? There we go. Hi, Adrian. Go ahead.
I'm still here. Sorry, I was just trying to respond to one of the chat room comments as well. Yeah, look, in terms of process, I mean, typically when one makes submissions, there's kind of, well, I suppose there could be more, but there's two kind of general categories of kind of submissions. The one would be procedural points. So in other words, the law says you must do X and you haven't done X. And then obviously there might be more substantive issues which go to things like nuclear safety and technical matters and those kind of issues. So when it comes to process, I mean, certainly, well, the question then arises, well, what is, from a process point of view, what are the problems? Well, certainly Angela has highlighted some of it, such as the redactions of information. We don't know what those redactions cover and whether it's important or critical information. So that is a concern. And there's other aspects as well. I mean, a lot of the underlying studies that are referred to, from the periodic safety review to the what they call the SALTO review done by the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which I can't remember exactly what it relates to, safety aspects of long-term operation. I think a lot of, all of their conclusions are reported, but they don't actually put up those reports itself. So it's very difficult for us as the public to verify or validate what's being claimed in the report. So to some extent, we're then forced to rely on Eskom's say-so. When it comes to public participation, when you look at the Enabling Act, it's obviously the NNR Act, and that requires two things. One is, once the application is made, it has to be publicized in the Government Gazette nationally and in 2 newspapers circulating within the municipal area that would be affected by the nuclear plant. And secondly, the NNR board is given a discretion. If they form the opinion that further public debate is needed, then they can hold public hearings. So if we cast our minds back to those who might have been involved in the submissions or hearings related to the Taspint application for a nuclear installation site license, there was an opportunity to comment. As we're in that period at the moment, though they've given certainly more than the 30 days, so they didn't go for the minimum in the current application. And certainly we would be calling for, assuming that's the position SAFCEI wants to take, we would be obviously motivating for public hearings to also be undertaken. So that's essentially what the NNR Act says. Obviously, there are other aspects that can come into that. Obviously, your constitutional rights. There's the Promotion of Administrative Justice Act that was enacted to give effect to the Constitution. That also makes provision mainly for 30-day commenting periods and the like. And of course, we always have to just keep in mind the Section 2 NEMA, or National Environmental Management Act principles, one of which, of course, talks about promoting participation, especially by vulnerable and disadvantaged communities, giving people the opportunity to develop skills, etc. So that also comes into it. So I hope that answers the question to some extent.
Thanks, Adrian. Angela, do you want to just add anything there quickly?
No, that's covered.
Okay, covered. Francesca, are you covered with that question as well?
I do have one point.
There we go. Go ahead, please.
I think the issue of the lack of, the failure to look at the impact of load shedding on nuclear safety is both a procedural and a substantive issue. So that procedurally they failed to look at something that's relevant. But I think substantively, we haven't got an expert report, but I very much doubt that there won't be any impact of load shedding on the future safety of this nuclear power station. So sometimes it's stated that if your complaints are purely procedural, that's insufficient. Yeah, that you need some sort of substantive prejudice. But I think there is. I think it would be difficult to deny that an unstable grid will not impact on the future of a nuclear power station, and that they really did have to grapple with that. And without having done that, perhaps it's open to the continued license is open to challenge. I'm not sure.
Definitely, 100%. Okay, I'm very aware of some questions and comments in the chat box. I know Aiden was responding to some of them directly, but I think there are 2 questions I just want to highlight to you, Angela and Aiden. Number 1 was, has there been any ocean studies that you know of on the impacts of radiation on the sea and human life? And then the second one, has there been any circular or Koeberg notification or newspaper or info or anything like that to the Koeberg residents in the area located locally to the power plant. So those two questions as well. Lydia might also come in on that second one, but Adrian, Angela, if you could answer first. Angela, if you could go ahead, I see you unmuted.
I don't have any knowledge of that, but that doesn't mean it hasn't happened.
Thank you. Adrian, do you want to add on that?
Sorry, I missed the second part.
Sure.
What was the second part? I'll get back to the first part after.
Okay, cool. The second part was, has there been any circular, any kind of communication from Koeberg, from Eskom, that you know of to the residents in the area of the power plant?
Okay, well, if you're talking about in relation to the long-term operation, I'm not aware of any, other than I have been advised that at least one newspaper advert was seen, but I haven't seen them myself. Obviously, there is the Public Safety Information Forum where they've, as far as I understand, I haven't been part of that, but I know SAFCEI and others are, where the LTO or the long-term operation has been reported on and kept up to date. And in fact, the SAFCEI notification came to them as a consequence of them being on that safety committee. But yeah, I'm not aware of any specific communication with people around it, other than through the safety forum, through the media, and through any statutory notification obligations that they had. When it comes to the impacts on the sea and things like that, basically, again, it's hard to validate because we don't necessarily have the underlying data, but according to them, according to the safety document and the public information document, obviously there would be some level of radioactivity in cooling water that I understand is discharged into the ocean, as well as some gaseous releases that have to happen. According to them, they're well under, and always have been and will continue in the future under the LTO to be well under those legislated, and they based on international standards, and that includes for the ocean. So they do give some. I think there's a table of the level of radiation that's given out, but yeah, not too much detail, unfortunately. But yeah, if what they're saying is true, they're certainly complying, or seem to have been complying with the regulated radiation related standards, if I can put it that way. But yeah, as I say, we don't have the monitoring reports. I haven't seen those scientific reports. So once again, we are relying on them, but there doesn't seem to be reason to think that that's erroneous at this stage.
Thanks, Adrian. Thanks, Angela. Liz, I see you have your hand up at this point.
Two things. One is does the NNR have to consider a worst case scenario in terms of assessing the application? And if so, a worst case scenario in terms of the ocean would be the release of radiation due to some or other incident, and the potential impact on the environment and the people. And similarly, given the population is so different from when this thing was set up, surely that is something else that the NNR would need to, given that their mandate is the public, protection of the public. And then my second question is actually another legal one, is whether the NEMA Section 28 could be triggered by this proposed LTO, and whether that would mean that, for example, an EIA or something could be argued for.
Thanks. I note your hand, Elena. Adrian, Angela, on Liz's two questions.
On the issue of the demographics, the changes in population, apparently they do say that they've considered that, but they considered it on the basis of census information, which is about 13, 12 years out of date. So that's a problem. And yeah, I'm not sure about the worst case scenario releasing, whether they have a duty. I would imagine they've got a duty to look at the consequences of worst case scenario, sure.
Adrian, do you want to comment on that as well?
Yeah. Yeah, again, I'm struggling because I don't have multiple screens, and I'd like to go onto the reports and see exactly what they say rather than rely on my, at the moment, somewhat saturated memory. But I recall seeing reference to possibly additional studies having been undertaken relating to demographics, where they look at whether there's been changes in land use, agriculture, those kind of things that could be impacted. And apparently, according to their last one, it wasn't. I can't recall having seen reference to the census there, so I'm not sure if Angela's referring to that report or census information elsewhere. But perhaps I just kind of overlooked it as I was reading. When it comes to, in terms of if there was a catastrophic incident, including a release of radioactive water and things into the ocean, obviously that would be a massive problem. One of the grounds that we raised in our submissions on Taspent was that their safety report, well, they hadn't given us the safety report, but gave us a PI, the public information document version of it, didn't address the catastrophic incidents and the potential impacts on things like, certainly in the Eastern Cape, they were talking about impacts on adjacent water uses, on regional water supply, and that could extend, of course, to food, I suppose, in Cape Town, wine farms, and the rest. So basically, a lot of the focus, as far as I can tell so far, seems to be on, well, the normal operation of Koeberg doesn't result in anticipated detrimental effects because they're well under the legislated limits. But then they don't go on to say, but if there was a meltdown or a catastrophic release or whatever, what those consequences would be. So, I mean, that's certainly one of the things that we would be looking at highlighting. Liz, when it comes to section, you mentioned section 28 of NEMA. Now, section 20, is that correct? Can you just confirm?
Yes.
Yeah. So section 28 of NEMA obviously imposes a duty of care on everyone who causes, may cause, or has caused pollution to take various reasonable steps to prevent, minimize, and remedy pollution. If that's what you're talking about, that's a general duty of care and doesn't in and of itself trigger an EIA. What triggers an EIA is your listed activities and listing notices 1, 2, and 3, including geographical areas, etc. So I'm not sure if you're thinking of something else, but yeah, as far as I know, that duty of care would apply generally to Koeberg and every other person or company that potentially impacts on the environment.
But I think the issue with section 28, from what I understand, is that if it's been encapsulated in legislation or in regulations and isn't just a standalone duty without a context like that any longer. Might have been before the regulations came into being.
Well, I mean, section 28 would apply to an operating company. So let's say you set up a sweet manufacturing company, and on a greenfield site that triggered an EIA, you did your EIA, you got your authorization, you got your waste license if appropriate, you got your air quality license. The section 28 NEMA duty would still apply throughout the operation. But what you're saying is, in its relationship to listed activities, the way the legislative scheme works, as I understand it, is the ministry is obviously given the power to determine activities that may significantly affect the environment and which require prior environmental authorization and obviously an assessment following either the basic assessment route or the full EIA, including scoping. So in that sense, it would have been built into those. and your authorization would often reiterate the Section 28 duty of care, and obviously include conditions around containment and remediation and reporting of emergencies and all of that kind of thing.
Can I follow up, Wayne?
Yeah, you can do a quick follow-up. Just a quick one.
Well, my reading of Section 28 says if you're not required to do an EIA, it would still apply. I hope I'm correct there. And then the reading of it, without going into the details, seems to be very clear that if we were to argue that Koeberg may cause harm into the future, we could ask for measures to be taken. And one of those measures is to investigate, assess, and evaluate the impact on the environment. So even if it's not a listed activity, it seems to me
You there, still this?
yeah.
Oh, sorry, we missed the last. Yeah, as you said, it seems to me, and then we dropped you.
Oh, sorry, it's just telling my internet is unstable. Can you still hear me?
I got you. Go ahead.
It seems to me from a reading of this clauses that there is a space where we could argue that despite it not being a listed activity, that given the circumstances, that would be maybe a challenge to the lawyers.
Yeah. Sorry, Liz, I think we just lost you a little bit, but please, if there are any more questions, Helena, do you want to add on that?
Can I just clarify what I meant? When I was working on my documentary about about Koeberg and nuclear waste, which took 8 to 10 years, and during that time, I spoke to quite a lot of experts. There was only one study done on the ocean by a UCT, and that was about 20 years ago. And it was very controlled, and it might have even been like not even real, like what their results were. I think they were questionable. And the only impact on human health study that has been done tried to be done was by Leslie London from UCT, and he couldn't get the funding to do it properly. So there hasn't ever been one done. And I think that should be a reason to complain, especially at this point, because I've also seen that over the years, what I heard, I don't know if it's true, but I don't know where I got it from actually, but I heard that there was an annual amount of radiation that was allowed to be released into the ocean by yearly, but it was slipped, or somebody said it, somebody who I spoke to, it could have been Derek Elbrecht, who worked at Koeberg, that sometime, I don't know if it was him, but that sometimes they just release that whole amount on one day. It doesn't necessarily get spread out little bit by bit over the year. So there might be like a plume, which no one will know about, and they don't really care, because it's very clear from what the things that we've just heard come out in the press, there's complete shambles going on actually. So like, unless somebody speaks up and does something, nothing's going to happen. And there was also something about shellfish that needed to be looked into. I think that was also a hearsay story that I heard, was that people eating shellfish in the area around Koeberg, because you can imagine that if there's going to be stuff that will be eaten by the bottom feeders, there was more cancers, and yeah, there's something to be looked into there, that it needs to be investigated. And if there's going to be a life extension, this would be a really good opportunity to push for those kinds of studies, because people are being affected.
Definitely, and I hear you 100%. I just want to, I think this conversation is so rich, and it really is providing some deep context to the issue of the life extension and what it means. But I have one or two things that I would like to sort of add in as well, in terms of how to make a submission directly, which I think are really important as well. So I think I want to just, if that's okay, go ahead with my part, and then we can continue some of this conversation after this. After I'm done. It will be very long, my part, but I think it's important that we sort of link it to what are the actual actions that we need to do while we are sort of exploring the context quite a bit. So I'm gonna go ahead with my presentation for now, and it won't take very long, as I said, but I think it's important. I see the chat is moving along, so if there are any questions in the chat, then you put them in there, or the conversation is continuing. I see. Let me just check. Francesca, sorry, can you confirm that you can see my screen?
Yep, it can be seen.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you so much. Appreciate that. Okay, so again, we've heard all the ideas from Angela and Adrian and various others in this thing of why not nuclear, why not the extension of this lifespan of this power plant. And I've just highlighted some of the main things which SAFCEI always talks about and really brings across to faith leaders very deeply. And the first one is, obviously, nuclear is the most costly option, with costs likely to increase during construction delays and costs of finance. Unfortunately, South Africa is not unique in this, but it has got a bit of a reputation in terms of corruption and cost overruns of big finance projects like nuclear, and others can be seen. And that is a real issue. Because of this, nuclear has not been demonstrated as the most affordable energy source, and usually South African taxpayers and consumers would have to bear these costs. So what is also known is that the waste produced by this plant still affects communities for generations. There's been a lot of discussion in this group now about high-level waste, where that goes to. We the communities in the Northern Cape, unfortunately, are still bearing the experiences of having that waste transport to their communities, and a lot of them are not have not been fully consulted about whether they agree to it or not. And for SAFCEI, from a faith point of view, we know that nuclear energy is morally wrong, because all faiths, no matter if you are Jewish, Christian, Muslim, whatever it is, call for earth care, and we know that nuclear is not good for the earth. We also know that it's not a solution to climate change or our current energy crisis that we find ourselves in, and it's definitely not a renewable energy source. And finally, one of the last points I want to make is the dangers around uranium mining. So this is not all-encompassing, but this is just, I wanted to highlight some of these points in conjunction to what Angela and Adrian and others have said a little bit earlier. This was shared a couple of years ago when we did another workshop, and I loved these slides because they actually talk about other things that were made in the 1970s. And, if we're asking for another 20 years on top of Koeberg's existed life already, can you imagine some of these things being still being used now and for 20 years into the future again? So the technology of this plant is old. So the question is, how do we comment? What do we do? How do we get about it? So we know there's not an unredacted safety case that's provided to communities. There's no environmental impact assessment. As I think Jenny pointed out a little bit earlier, there's no, in my view, adequate plan for evacuation if the worst happens. The demographics of that area have changed completely since the last time a census was done in that area, which I think is 2011. So without all of these information, answers to these questions, how are we supposed to make a fully informed decision whether we agree with the life extension of the Koeberg Nuclear Power Plant? So what you would need to do is you can request in an email that the NNR of the Eskom and Koeberg come do a meaningful consultation in your community. That is one of the things you can actually do. But what we would like everybody to do is before the deadline of the 16th of March, you can mail the Koeberg LTO. The email address is on your screen now, and I will share it afterwards. And you can CC Gino Munsami at nnr.co.za as well, with your comment of why you believe Koeberg itself should not be extended. And these, again, we provided many reasons now. I will share this and some of these other reasons after this meeting to everybody, so you will have the information at your fingertips. But this is all you can do, and this is the best thing you can do, is daily email the National Nuclear Regulator and state your comment directly, so that they know that the communities in and around Koeberg and in and around South Africa have a voice about this issue. Obviously, SAFCEI is working really hard on social media, and you can share the various posts that we have. We have various hashtags that we use, including Nuclear Free SA and Energy Plan for All. And we can really start getting people talking about this issue and making sure that it is high on our priorities, because as we've heard here, there are far too many variables in this proposed lifespan of this power plant for it to go ahead. We can tag the National Nuclear Regulator, we can tag the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, we can tag the national regulator, energy regulator of Africa, so they can see that we are commenting on the process and engaging with this process. I think while we have a strong history of public participation and engagement, often these government departments don't take it seriously, or think that, you know, there's not a strong wave of impetus to stand in the way of some of this decision making. So we can really sort of make it clear to them in what we're doing. There is a little bit of good news associated with this as well. As faith leaders, and not only faith leaders, but people of faith, we can make a difference. SAFCEI often has vigils every month, has nuclear vigils outside of Parliament, which raises the issue and keeps this issue on the forefront of people coming into town and parliamentarians. And we know that if Koeberg shuts down on schedule, no more nuclear power in Africa. And the reason, obviously, for shutting down can be used around Africa. This will be a real win for the anti-nuclear movement. And now is the time we know when civil action will be most effective directly. So that's what you can do. I will share the email address, excuse me, in the chat box again. But we would encourage everybody before the 16th of March to make your submission, email the NNR and let them know why you believe that Koeberg should not have an extension of life in South Africa. Angela and Adrian, do you want to just add anything on what I've said now?
No, not necessary from me.
Adrian?
Yeah, not too much, but maybe just on the one slide. Yeah, I mean, I think some of those points, like the cost, one just if one's relying on older information relating to, for example, submissions made on a new nuclear power plant, we just must be aware that the situation is different here because you've got an existing plant. So
Sure.
the price has already been spent, and well, the money on the plant the construction costs obviously have already been paid back over the last 40 years of operation. That doesn't mean that it won't have an impact on electricity prices. We don't know, and as far as I can see, the documents they provide us are silent on that issue. So we don't know the full costs of the LTO. And what they will be, and whether that will push up the cost of generation, although it has been suggested to me that it will, and it'll certainly, the suggestion is that it would push it up over the current costs of procuring new renewable energy, which of course have come down in the various bid windows over time. So that's the one aspect. And then perhaps just a last kind of mention on the Section 28 issue. Just to follow up on that, and also seeing things in the group. My understanding, so it's a duty of care, and various things are triggered under that, which you know, taking reasonable measures may include various things, including investigating and assessing those impacts. Further down in the subsections, I think it gives the power to the department that if you know, if they believe there's a significant or a risk, or I can't remember the exact wording, you know, of pollution being caused, having been caused, or may be caused, they have the discretionary power to require a person to undertake the investigation, assessment, etc. of the impacts. So it doesn't necessarily mean an EIA is triggered. It could be a similar kind of process, but not necessarily within the kind of EIA listed notice type of process. But that, yeah, it gets quite complex. So if we want to unpack that, we would need to spend a bit more time looking at it. But that would rely on getting the decision maker or the relevant or competent authority, which in this case I think would be the National Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, to exercise that power and direct Eskom to undertake those studies. And perhaps one could make an argument, for example, that because they haven't done an EIA, they should do that. Who knows? But perhaps that's not. Yeah, it may be a separate process than this particular commenting opportunity, which is obviously aimed at the NNR, the National Nuclear Regulator, as the regulatory authority. But yeah, certainly keep an open mind with that. Yeah, but it's interesting to hear the views. So thank you for that, Liz and others.
And there's also a point, though, Adrian, if the National Nuclear Regulator is going to apply its mind to all relevant considerations, which it has to, then surely it would need all that information as well, even though it might. Yeah, so given the particular circumstances we're in, especially.
I hear you. Thanks, Angela. Thank you. And those are really good points. I mean, I think for me, as I said in what I actually had to say, there are far too many unknown variables to actually safely say that the plant can get a life extension. You know, and these are piling up, you know, whether it's costs, whether it's EIA, whether it's a whole raft of questions, things like the waste, what is going to happen around evacuations in the area. All of these questions pile up. And I think if we don't have the answer to those, we can't make a informed decision. And that means that the plant, we cannot be considered for any kind of life extension. Exactly. Climate change, sea level rise, the change in our environment around the plant. Well, thank you, Francesca, 100%. Gosh. I just want to check if there's any last questions. I know we're running out of time, and I know, you know, we did say till 3:30. Any last questions? I'm happy to take them and see if we've got any comments about them. It sounds like silence is golden. No other questions.
I've got a comment.
Please.
When
Please.
your presentation was obviously so good that it's shut everyone up. Which wasn't what it was meant to do, but you were all having such a great flow earlier, and I thought your presentation was excellent, Wayne, and also Angela, and thanks for all the contributions. I'm just wondering, does anyone have any burning questions or issues that they've got outstanding? Do you feel that everything was answered? It's really important that no question is a dumb question in these spaces. If you've got something that's been circulating in your brain for a while, please share it. We don't often have both Adrian and Angela and Liz and all of you on a call together. So let's make use of our time together. And I'm going to hand back to Wayne because I can see Liz's hand is up. Thank you.
Thanks, Francesca. Great. Liz, please.
The short thing is, yeah, thanks for the inputs. It's quite interesting. I wanted to just say that the Green Connection and SAFCEI are hosting a workshop 2 weeks' time, and so I see some of the people on this call will be there. So just to alert them that there will be a space for us to actually work out what we're going to say, and hopefully an opportunity to hand over those submissions to the NNR in person. It's just an announcement.
That's all good. Thank you. No problem.
Which would be really exciting.
It would be.
And if others of you want to join us in a submission in person, you're welcome to join us. We can share that date.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think even if just the people on this call get 3 other people to fill out a submission, and you ask them to get 3 other people to fill out a submission, it will be a massive, massive achievement. So just to demystify this, don't feel like it's something you can't comment on. You can, and we will circulate the slides, and you can just comment from your own faith point of view, your own faith perspective, or your perspective as a resident, or your perspective as an earth keeper, or a more technical perspective if you wish to take that approach. All comments should be welcomed in a democracy where public participation is important. So thanks so much, everyone. And thanks, Wayne, for chairing us so ably this afternoon. It's been a really interesting conversation. Thanks.
Thanks, Francesca. Thanks, everybody. Just before we close off with our prayer, our usual prayer at the end, I wonder if we could ask, maybe if you can, everyone to put their cameras on, just so I can take a pic and just, you know, keep our records. Hi,
I think I must have shared my link.
Yeah, you must. I think you shared your link. Nice background,
I'm
Liz.
doing in more than one place.
Okay, great. If you can't, that's fine. I'm just gonna, in 3, 2, 1, smile, everybody. There we go. Zainab, hello. There we go.
Hi.
I think I've got it. Let me just make sure I've got it. And then I've actually asked, is Sanele still on the call? Sanele, are you there? Sanele? If she can't unmute. Okay, Reverend Gwen.
Hi, Wayne.
Hello. Oh, there you are, Sanele. There we go. There we go. Please go ahead, Sanele. Could you close off in prayer? Thank you.
Masivaleni amehlo. Egameni lesomlenya noma ingcwele baba siyabulela njengoba besicelile xaxa imithini yethu mesulungileyo. Uye wavula inhliziyo yethu nengqondo zethu sava sonke sithethiwe mesulungileyo. Yanga singaqhuba njalo simamela yonke into ethethayo. Uthethelele kuzo zonke indlela ngegameni lesomlenya. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Sanele. Thanks, everybody. Have a lovely day. And please, if you got any questions or comments, email me. My email's in the chat if you need to. But let's get some good comments in and make sure that this does not go ahead.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Have a good one.
Thanks
Cheers,
so
guys.
much.
Thanks, eh?
Thank
Take
you
it
all.
easy.
Thanks,
Bye.
Adrian. Appreciate it. Thanks, Elena. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Have a good day. Cheers.